Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner again, and today I am coming to you from the upper section of beautiful Jordan Pond in Maine. The mountains behind me are called the Bubbles, and if you haven't been here, this is a place you want to get to someday. It's kind of an appropriate setting because today we're going to be reading our first piece in our Origins of the American Tradition unit. We don't know exactly how far this piece dates back in time, but we know that it was a work of the Iroquois. Now, the Iroquois was a confederation of different Indian nations in the New York area. And we'll go through all that in the slide period in a second. But we're going to take a look at just an excerpt from this, and then we'll talk briefly about the importance of it before you read it. So let's get started. All right, here we are. We're going to be reading this piece called From the Iroquois Constitution. Sometimes you might see this listed as the Iroquois Confederation. It's the same document. And it describes the form of government of 5 nations of American Indians in the New York area that under the title Iroquois came together. Now, Iroquois is a French term. That is not a name that they gave to themselves. In fact, they called themselves the Haudenosaunee, which means the people of the Longhouse. And down in the lower right hand of this screen, that is a sketch of what a longhouse was. So this particular group of Native Americans didn't live in teepees, they didn't live in igloos, they didn't live in cabins, but they built these very long, they would house several families together, hence the name longhouses, with a wooden frame and then usually a birch bark type exterior. There was a separate sleeping area, kitchen area, social area. It was almost like living in a dormitory in those days. So let's go on through this. So our lesson essential question for today is going to be what elements of content and style, those 2 key words, content and style, are going to pop up a lot, assure the Iroquois Constitution its place in the American literary tradition. In other words, what is it about this piece specifically that makes it American lit and makes it an important piece of American lit? Now, over on the left side here, I put something which is called the Tree of Peace. You see, the Iroquois still exists today, and they still abide by these same symbols. And as we read the Constitution, this will be explained. But you know that a symbol in literature is something that stands for itself and something else. And so in here we have a tree, we have very long roots, 4 of them actually, and the 4 roots is important, right? We have a war club down here, and we have an eagle at the top. So if you can kind of remember that as we go through the piece, it'll help make a little bit more sense. Now, who are the 5 nations? They were the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. And if you take a look at the map over here, you get a rough idea. So here's Lake Ontario. Pennsylvania is below this line right here. So you can see that the Onondaga and the Oneida stretch down into Pennsylvania just a little bit. But you see the territories of the 3. And they built a trail, and the trail crossed all of them for the purpose of trade routes and things like that. And they granted each of the other nations permission to cross. So economically and socially, it was better for all of them to have these rules by which they could kind of coexist in peace and watch out for one another. Also, you'll notice that the Seneca, being on the far west, and the Mohawk on the far east, are more vulnerable than the other 3. And so if someone were attacking, these here in the middle agreed that they would come and help their brothers on the outer part. Now, sometimes you'll see, in fact, today, you'll see the 5 nations referred to as the 6 nations, because eventually the Tuscarora also joined them, and it became the 6 nations. But at the time this Iroquois Constitution was put together, it was just the 5. And you notice here the trail that I was talking about, it is the Haudenosaunee Trail. So that literally means people of the Longhouse Trail. And if you take a look at your map here, so this is 100 miles. That's probably 1, 2. You're looking at over 200 miles to cross the entire territory there. So it's a big chunk of land. Now, just think about this. We're not going to actually write it right now, but what if you were going to form a new government? Start from, nothing and have a government put together. That would be a constitution. You'd have to negotiate certain things and debate and decide what was best for the entire group as well as the individual, because you don't want to lose all of your individuality. Uh, some people dispute this, but a lot of historians believe that Benjamin Franklin used the Iroquois Constitution as a model when he came to the United States Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, as they debated how will this new United States government work. Again, like I said, some historians will say there is no evidence of that, but it's a story in American history that's persisted for a long time. There's that image of the Longhouse once again. And so the Five Nations were formed in the 15th or 16th century. So that would be as far back as the 1400s. Remember, because the first century was from 0 to 99, we're always like, when we talk about 16th century, that's the 1500s, 15th century is the 1400s. We're not exactly sure when this got started because it was oral tradition. It wasn't a written document. It was memorized and passed from tribal leader to tribal leader. Now, according to the legend, a Huron diplomat by the name of Dekanawida was one of the two people who visited the different nations and argued in favor of this. Now, you notice that Dekanawida is a Huron. The Hurons weren't part of the Iroquois, but he was adopted by the Iroquois. I believe he was a Mohawk. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to check my notes on that. But he believed that peace was the way to go. And so he, along with Hiawatha, and you might know the name Hiawatha from the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem. That's kind of what made him famous. He was an Onondaga. And the two of them traveled to each of the nations and made the argument for unity. Let's pull together. Let's pool our resources. Let's protect one another. Let's trade with one another. You have resources that we don't. We have resources that you do. And so it's really a very sophisticated document when you think about it. Life for all of the nations of the Iroquois, it was hunting, but they were also a farming community. You remember when some of the first settlers came here from Europe, they were taught some farming techniques by the local Native Americans. So they weren't just hunters, but they were also farmers. They lived in these long houses, so it was a very social kind of thing. And their voting rights were kind of interesting too. When it came down to electing war chiefs, it was actually the women who had the voting rights to elect who would be in the council. So that's kind of an interesting thing, very different from European culture, where men did all the voting, all the running for office. And even in the United States, it wasn't until the 19th Amendment in the 1920s that women got the first chance to vote. So these peace chiefs on the council were actually elected by women. And remember, women are mothers. They might think much more carefully about sending their children off to war. And so it was another way to help keep the peace. Unfortunately for all of the Iroquois, once those European settlers came, you know, they brought some terrible diseases like smallpox. When a new virus comes along and there's no resistance, it tends to spread very, very quickly. And unfortunately, the Iroquois were decimated by the disease that was brought. And then later on, unfortunately, the Six Nations were torn apart. They're back together today, but they were torn apart by European wars. The 7 Years' War, which you know in Americas was called the French and Indian War, and then the American Revolution. Some of these nations fought on the side of the British, some of them fought on the side of the French, and during the American Revolution, some were on the side of the British, some were on the side of the American patriots. And so as much as they tried to create peace, it was the American settlers who tore up their peace. And as I said, some people think that Benjamin Franklin used this as a model when he spoke to the convention. There is no physical evidence of that today, but the legend persists. And so there's always some truth in a legend. That's what makes it a legend. Now, we talked about symbols. So again, a symbol is something that stands for both itself and something else. And a lot of oral history type documents, and this is an oral history type document, use symbols to help people understand things. Specifically, again here, think of the leaves, think of the eagle, think of the roots, think of the war club. These are all going to be mentioned when you read the excerpt from the Iroquois Constitution. All right, so you're going to read the selection, and as you read the selection, I want you to look for the symbols. What are the symbols? What do they symbolize? And as part of that, why are they important to the document? I want you to look for the beliefs of the people. What did they value? If they were arguing in favor of this peace between the five nations, where did they stand? And what about the idea of representative government? The idea that you choose your representatives who then meet with the other representatives, and it's their mission to act on your behalf and on behalf of the whole. So look for those things as you read. All right, so what you're going to do if you're watching the video only right now is you're going to stop it and you're going to go read the excerpt. Right? If you're in class and we've already read it together, what we're going to do now is we'll take a look at those check for understanding questions. So here's your first one. Dekanawida and Hiawatha together are credited with doing what? Dekanawida and Hiawatha together are credited with doing what? And that's right, they were the founders of the Iroquois Confederation or Constitution. They are the ones who traveled to each of the original five nations and convinced leaders to join. How many nations originally formed the Iroquois Constitution in the 15th or 16th century? Pretty simple, we've been saying it again and again. They were originally five: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk, and later the Tuscarora joined them. Who elected the male chiefs of the Iroquois Confederacy? Yes, it was women. If you were a member of the Iroquois Constitution, women had the right to vote long before, several hundred years before they had the right to vote in the United States. What concept attracted Benjamin Franklin to the Iroquois Constitution? Now, this question comes from your textbook, and your textbook takes the stance that it really was a model for Benjamin Franklin, all right? Many people believe that, but I'm telling you that I think it's fair to realize that many historians also question whether or not that is fact or legend. And of course, it was the ideas about representative government, the idea that we can't all vote on every law and every issue. There's no way we could be informed enough. Most people don't know enough about economics, for example, to be able to vote for a complicated banking law, which is why we elect representatives who then have experts who inform them, and they make the best decision that way. If we don't like the representation we're getting from that representative, then we elect a new one. And so the legend is that Benjamin Franklin liked this, and he brought it to the United States Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. All right, what do the roots of the tree of the long leaves symbolize? So in the image, there are four roots, and they're peace and strength. All right, roots go deep down. The farther into the ground they go, the more strength there is. And sometimes this gets interpreted as well that the four roots are the four directions, which are very mystical: north, south, east, and west, and each one has a different meaning. What does the eagle at the top of the tree of peace symbolize? Well, we know today eagles have incredible vision. I don't know how they figured this out, but I once read that if you held up a newspaper and an eagle could read, the eagle could read the headline at a distance of a mile. I don't know what ophthalmologist gave an eye test to an eagle, but that's what I read. So the eagle's at the top of the tree where he can see the farthest, and so that's vigilance, almost like the guard. And remember again, those outer boundaries had the promise of the nations in the central part to come to their aid should someone attack them. So that was vigilance. And then the antlers. So the antlers are given to the Lord when he becomes a member. You read that in the whole thing here. And they symbolize leadership of the tribal lords. So once you have your antlers, you are in fact one of the leaders of the tribal council. All right, so that's everything that we have for the Iroquois Constitution. You may also be assigned to do a check for understanding quiz, or you may be asked to do some levels of thinking questions that go with this. So be sure to check in Schoology and make sure that you get everything that goes with this. Again, thank you for staying with me the whole time, and I'll see you for the next lesson.